The first volley was a disgrace, a ragged pop-bang, like cheap fireworks going off in a tin barrel. It wasn't the sharp, unified crack of 7 rifles speaking as one. It was a clattering argument of sounds, a disrespect made audible. In the front row, the colonel's widow flinched, her gloved hands tightening into fists. The insult echoed across the manicured lawns of the National Cemetery, over the rows of silent white stones. The young captain in charge of the detail felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. "Get it together, Sergeant," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for the NCO beside him, but the wind carried it to the mourners nearby. At the back of the small crowd, an old man in a baggy suit leaned on a simple hickory cane, his shoulders slumping just a little. "They've lost the rhythm," he murmured to no one at all, his voice a dry rasp lost in the breeze. The man was about to be dismissed and ignored, a ghost at a funeral, but he was the only person standing on that hallowed ground who knew how to fix it. He was the only one who understood that the rhythm wasn't in the hands, but in the heart. Type honor if you believe respect is earned, not given. His name was Arthur Pendleton, and he was 86 years old. Time had whittled him down, shrinking him inside a dark gray suit that had fit him perfectly 30 years ago. Now the shoulders drooped, and the fabric pooled around his worn but polished dress shoes. His hands, resting atop the smooth handle of his cane, were a lattice work of raised veins and liver spots, and they held a fine, constant tremor. It wasn't the shaking of fear or weakness, but the simple, weary vibration of a machine that had been running for a very long time. Yet, for all the frailty life had imposed upon him, his eyes were as clear and pale as a winter sky. They missed nothing. The nervous tick in the young captain's jaw, the way the flag rippled against the gray clouds, the almost imperceptible tremble in the hands of the youngest soldier holding a rifle. Arthur stood at the edge of the mourners, partially shielded by a large oak tree, its bare branches reaching like skeletal fingers towards the heavens. He hadn't wanted to intrude, to push himself into the family space. His connection to the man in the flag-draped casket was old, forged in a different time, under a different sky. He remembered Colonel John Abernathy not as the decorated officer being laid to rest, but as a terrified second lieutenant with fresh-faced optimism and a map he couldn't quite fold correctly. Arthur had been his platoon sergeant then, a lifetime ago. "It's not about the map, sir," he'd told the young officer. "It's about knowing which way is north even when the map is mud." He had taught the boy how to be a man, and the man how to be a leader. Now all that was left was this final, fumbled goodbye. He shifted his weight, and the posture, even now, was unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. He wasn't slumped over his cane like an invalid. He was at a modified parade rest, a position of relaxed readiness so deeply ingrained in his muscle memory that it had become a part of his skeleton. It was the stance of a man who had spent 50 years waiting for the next order or giving it. That stance and the dull gleam on his old leather shoes were the only clues to the man he had once been. But what no one knew, least of all the flustered captain in charge, was that Arthur Pendleton wasn't just another mourner. He was the reason a 3-volley salute was fired with precision at all, and he was about to give one last lesson. The Arlington National Cemetery was a place of solemn geometric beauty. The rolling hills were blanketed in a carpet of dormant grass, the color of wet straw under the oppressive gray sky. A cold November wind whipped through the grounds, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the faint metallic tang of impending snow. It snapped the large flag at the entrance, the percussive crack of the fabric, a lonely drumbeat in the funereal quiet. The mourners were a small cluster of black and gray, huddled together near the open grave, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Among them stood Captain Evan Hayes, a man who looked as though he had been carved from protocol. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his ribbons precisely aligned, his shoes gleaming with a mirror finish, but his posture was rigid, his movements jerky. He was a man performing a duty, not paying a tribute. He kept glancing at his watch, a subordinate to time, his mind already on the next task, the next report, the next item on his checklist. He saw the ceremony not as a sacred rite, but as a logistical problem with too many variables: the weather, the grieving family, and now this incompetent firing squad. The squad itself was a collection of boys trying to look like men. 7 of them, their M14s held with a mixture of reverence and terror. Their own breath fogged around their faces, their knuckles white where they gripped the wooden stocks. You could see the tension in the set of their shoulders, the way their eyes darted, looking for cues from their sergeant, a young man named Miller, who was doing his best to project a calm he did not feel. One soldier in particular, a Private Green on the far end, couldn't stop swallowing. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat like a fisherman's float on a choppy lake. He was the epicenter of the squad's anxiety, a weak link in a chain that demanded absolute uniformity. Arthur watched them from his place under the oak, feeling a familiar pang of empathy. They were just kids, overwhelmed by the gravity of their task. They needed a leader, a focal point, a steady hand to guide them through the ceremony. What they had was Captain Hayes, whose simmering rage was a contagion, spreading through the ranks and turning their nervousness into outright fear. 200 miles away, in a quiet, wood-paneled office at the Pentagon, a 4-star general stared at a photograph on his desk. It was a picture of a much younger him, a cocky lieutenant with a half-smirk, his arm slung around a stern-faced sergeant major whose gaze could have chipped granite. He had no idea his phone was about to ring with a call that would have him breaking every speed limit to get to that very cemetery. The chaplain's words were kind, weaving a tapestry of a life well lived, a service honorably rendered. He spoke of duty, of sacrifice, of a man who loved his country and his family. Arthur listened, his head bowed slightly, the memories washing over him. He remembered Abernathy's letters from home, the way he'd read them over and over until the paper grew soft as cloth. He remembered the fierce pride in the man's eyes when his first child was born, a daughter he wouldn't meet for another 6 months. These were the things that mattered, the pieces of a life that no uniform or rank could fully contain. But the uniform demanded its own tribute, a final sharp punctuation to a life of service. The chaplain finished his prayer and stepped back. The air grew heavy with anticipation. Captain Hayes nodded stiffly to Sergeant Miller. The sergeant took a deep breath, his voice cracking slightly as he gave the first command. "Firing party! Port arms!" 7 rifles were brought up in unison, but the movement was hesitant, lacking the crisp snap of a well-drilled unit. "Ready!" The rifles were raised, aimed towards the sky. From the back, Arthur could see Private Green's weapon trembling slightly. The boy was holding his breath, his chest locked tight. It was the classic mistake. You don't hold your breath, you release it. You find the still point at the bottom of the exhale, and you act in that perfect quiet moment. Sergeant Miller raised his hand, then chopped it down. The command to fire was swallowed by the ragged explosion of noise. One shot a fraction of a second early, another a half-second late, the rest somewhere in between. It was a shambles. The sound was offensive, an acoustic stain on the solemnity of the moment. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor Vance, the colonel's widow, squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear tracing a path down her powdered cheek. This was not the honor her husband had earned. This was a noisy, clumsy failure. Captain Hayes spun on his heel, his face a thunder cloud of crimson fury. He stalked towards Sergeant Miller, his voice a low, furious hiss that was perfectly audible in the stunned silence. "What was that, Sergeant? What in God's name was that?" The public reprimand was a violation of protocol, a failure of leadership more profound than the botched volley itself. Sergeant Miller's face, already pale from the cold, drained of all remaining color. He was being dressed down in front of his men, in front of the grieving family. Humiliation warred with duty. "We'll get it right, sir," he stammered, turning back to his squad. "Steady, men. Watch my hand. Watch me." His voice was strained, pleading. He was trying to will them into competence, but the captain's anger had shattered their already fragile confidence. They were no longer a unit. They were 7 scared individuals, each terrified of being the next one to make a mistake. Miller gave the commands again. "Ready! Aim!" He held his hand up, his eyes wide, trying to make contact with each of his soldiers at once. He chopped his hand down. The second volley was even worse than the first. It was a panicked stutter-step of reports, a cascade of bangs that had no beginning and no end. It sounded like a string of firecrackers tossed onto pavement. This time, Private Green's flinch was obvious, his rifle firing a full second after everyone else's, a final, lonely pop that underscored the complete collapse of discipline. The disrespect was now a tangible thing, hanging in the air like smoke. Whispers broke out among the mourners. An elderly man in a VFW hat shook his head in disgust. The ceremony had devolved from solemn to embarrassing. This was a disgrace to the uniform, to the flag, to the man they were supposed to be honoring. Captain Hayes looked as if he was going to explode. His professionalism, his carefully constructed career, was unraveling before his eyes. He abandoned all pretense of decorum and strode directly in front of the firing squad. "That is absolutely, positively unacceptable," he shouted, his voice echoing across the tombstones. "You are a disgrace to this uniform. You are disgracing the memory of a great officer." He pointed a trembling finger at Private Green. "You! What is your problem, soldier?" It was then that Arthur moved. He took a single, deliberate step forward, emerging from the shadow of the oak tree. He planted the hickory cane firmly on the soft turf, the tip sinking slightly into the ground. He said nothing. He did nothing else. But the simple, solid act of planting his cane was a statement. It was a line being drawn. The young captain thought he was taking control of a botched ceremony. He was wrong. He had just lost control of everything, starting with his own career. From Arthur's perspective, the scene unfolded with a kind of slow-motion horror. He wasn't angry at the boys with the rifles. He saw their youth, their inexperience, the crushing weight of the moment. He saw Private Green, a boy no older than Arthur's own grandson, and he didn't see a failure. He saw a child tasked with a man's solemn duty, a child whose hands were shaking because he understood the importance of his task all too well and was terrified of failing it. He needed a leader to absorb that fear, to ground him, not a tyrant, to multiply it. His anger, cold and quiet, was reserved for Captain Hayes. The man wore the uniform, held the rank, but he didn't possess the spirit of leadership. He led with his collar insignia, not with his presence. He commanded with threats, not with confidence. Arthur had seen 100 officers like him over the years. They were brittle. They looked good on paper and shattered under the slightest pressure. They confused shouting with authority. They managed schedules but failed to lead soldiers. And in his fury, Hayes was committing the cardinal sin. He was making it about himself, his career, his reputation, his perfectly executed ceremony. He had forgotten the reason they were all there, to honor John Abernathy. Arthur's mind drifted back 50 years to a muddy field in a country nobody at home could find on a map. Lieutenant Abernathy, barely 21, had been giving orders, his voice high and tight with panic as enemy fire raked their position. Arthur had crawled over to him, got right in his ear, and said, "Breathe, Lieutenant, just breathe. They can't hear your orders if you're squeaking. Deeper, from the gut. Now try again." The young officer had taken a deep, ragged breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was clear, calm, and commanding. The men had responded, the line had held, and they had lived to see the next day. "Everything is in the breathing," Arthur whispered to himself now, the old lesson echoing in his mind. The decision to intervene wasn't a conscious choice. It was an instinct, a reflex honed over a lifetime of service. He could not stand by and watch John's memory be tarnished by this incompetence. He could not let those boys be broken by this officer's ego. The uniform on their backs deserved better. The man in that casket deserved better. He took another step forward. As Captain Hayes continued to berate the terrified Private Green, his voice rising in pitch and volume, Arthur spoke. His own voice was not loud. It was low and gravelly, weathered by age and countless shouted commands on windy firing ranges, but it possessed a quality that the captains lacked: resonance. It cut through the air, through Hayes's shrill tirade, and landed with the weight of stone. "Captain!" Just that one word. It was not a question. It was a summons. Hayes stopped mid-sentence and spun around, his face a mask of disbelief. "Who are you?" he snapped, his eyes narrowing at the old man in the ill-fitting suit. "This is a restricted area for the funeral detail and family. Step back, behind the line, old man." Arthur's pale blue eyes didn't even flicker towards the captain. He ignored him as completely as if he were a piece of furniture. His gaze went past the furious officer, past the NCO, and settled directly on the 7 soldiers of the firing party. Specifically, he looked at Sergeant Miller. "Son," he said, his voice calm and steady, a teacher's voice, "what's the count?" The question hung in the air, bizarre and out of place to most of the mourners. Sergeant Miller, caught between his belligerent commander and this strangely authoritative old man, was momentarily paralyzed. But the question was a technical one, a query from one professional to another, and his training kicked in. He answered instinctively. "Sir, the count?" "The cadence," Arthur clarified, his voice patient. "The breath. What's the count you're using for the volley?" This was the trigger. It was a question no civilian, no casual observer would ever think to ask. It was insider's language, the arcane terminology of drill and ceremony. It spoke of a deep, ingrained knowledge that had nothing to do with the baggy suit and the trembling hands. It was a subtle challenge to the captain's authority, not by questioning his rank, but by questioning his competence on the most fundamental level. And as he stood there, challenging a commissioned officer, the tremor in his hands stilled completely. It was replaced by a certainty that hadn't been there for 20 years, the same certainty he'd felt on a frozen hill in Korea, calling out orders while the world exploded around him. In the crowd of mourners stood a retired Army major named Peterson. He had served 25 years and had seen his share of ceremonies, both good and bad. This one, he thought grimly, was shaping up to be one of the worst. He had been recording snippets of it on his phone, intending to send it to the base commander with a formal complaint about the dishonor being done to Colonel Abernathy, a man he had admired. When the ancient-looking man in the gray suit stepped forward, Peterson had sighed, assuming it was a confused relative about to make a scene. But then the old man spoke. The voice, the question, "What's the count?" sent a jolt through the major. He immediately zoomed the phone's camera in on the man's face. The features were softened and wrinkled by age, but there was something in the set of his jaw, the unwavering steel in his eyes. It was a look he'd seen before in old photographs, in training manuals from a bygone era. A half-forgotten name clawed at the edges of his memory. On impulse, Peterson stopped recording, edited the 30-second clip, and sent it to a private group chat of fellow retired officers from the 101st Airborne. His accompanying text was simple. At Abernathy's funeral at Arlington, the honor guard is a train wreck. Anyone know this old-timer who just stepped up? He's got the CO losing his mind. The message bounced from phone to phone, a digital ripple spreading through a network of old soldiers. Within 3 minutes, it was forwarded to the aide-de-camp of General Marcus Thorne, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The aide, a young, sharp-eyed colonel, recognized the potential for a serious incident. He discreetly walked into the general's office. "Sir, you need to see this." General Thorne, deep in paperwork, looked up with irritation. The aide played the video. Thorne watched, his expression shifting from annoyance to mild interest, and then to stunned, absolute disbelief. He saw the baggy suit, the hickory cane, the embarrassing volley. Then he heard the voice, the cadence, the breath. "What's the count you're using?" The general froze. His blood ran cold. He would know that voice in his sleep. He would know that posture, that quiet, unshakable authority, if he were blind. He stood up so fast his chair screeched back against the hardwood floor. "Get the helicopter ready," he commanded, his voice tight with a sudden, overwhelming urgency. "Now." Back at the windswept grave site, Captain Hayes had reached his breaking point. This civilian's interference was the final humiliation. The man was undermining his authority in front of his troops, in front of a grieving family. "I am in command of this detail," Hayes declared, his voice shaking with rage, "and I will have you removed for interfering with a military funeral." He gestured sharply to 2 military police officers who stood at a respectful distance, providing security for the event. "Escort this man off the premises immediately." The MPs, a young sergeant and a private, exchanged an uneasy glance. They started forward, their duty clear, but their instincts screaming that something was wrong here. Arthur Pendleton did not even grant Captain Hayes a glance. His attention was a laser beam focused on Private Green, the terrified soldier at the end of the line. He saw the boy's chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked gasps. "Breathe, son," Arthur said, his voice soft but carrying. "In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Simple as that. The rifle is just a part of your arm. It doesn't move until your breath is still and the world is quiet. You find the quiet." The MPs reached him, one on each side. "Sir," the sergeant said, his voice polite but firm. "You need to come with us now." Before they could take his arm, another voice cut in, this one quiet and laced with grief, but ringing with indisputable authority. "Let him be." It was Eleanor Vance, the colonel's widow. She had risen from her chair and taken a step forward. Her eyes, red-rimmed but clear, were fixed on Arthur. Let him try. Captain Hayes was now completely trapped. To defy the direct plea of the grieving widow would be an act of unimaginable cruelty. To allow this strange, meddling civilian to take control of his honor guard was an unthinkable dereliction of his own duty. He made the worst possible choice. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is a military procedure with strict protocols," he said, his tone condescending. He turned back to Arthur, his face a grimace of fury. "This is your last warning. Leave now, or you will be arrested." But what none of them knew, not the arrogant captain, not the nervous soldiers, not even the grieving widow who had put her faith in a stranger, was that the rhythmic thumping sound starting to build in the distance wasn't thunder. It was the sound of vindication arriving at 150 miles per hour. The insistent whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of helicopter blades grew rapidly from a distant hum to an overwhelming presence. Everyone instinctively looked up. The sky was a uniform sheet of gray, but against it, a dark shape was descending rapidly. It was a UH-60 Blackhawk, sleek and menacing, and it was heading directly for them. The distraction was total. Captain Hayes stared, his mouth agape. The MPs paused, their hands hovering near Arthur's elbows. In that moment of shared confusion, Arthur acted. He raised his hickory cane, not as a weapon or a crutch, but as a conductor raises a baton. He brought the tip down sharply on the paved walkway. The single sharp tap was shockingly loud in the sudden lull. It was a sound of pure, undiluted authority. "Sergeant," Arthur said, and his voice had changed. The frail, raspy quality was gone. It was replaced by a deep, resonant baritone that rolled across the grounds, a command voice that had once echoed across parade fields and battlefields alike. It was a voice that expected and received instant obedience. "On my mark, give them the preparatory command for the final volley." Sergeant Miller was paralyzed for a heart-stopping second. He looked at Captain Hayes, who was still gawking at the descending helicopter. He looked at the two MPs, who were looking at him. Then he looked at the old man. He saw the stillness in his body, the absolute certainty in his pale eyes. He made the choice that would define his career. He trusted the voice. He snapped his head forward. "Ready!" he barked, his own voice now sharp and clear, catching the fire from Arthur's. The 7 soldiers, startled back to their duty, responded instantly, their movements clean and sure. "Aim!" Arthur commanded himself, his voice overriding everyone else's. The 7 rifles rose as one, a single fluid motion. They were a unit again. "Breathe," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, an intimate instruction meant only for the 7 men before him. The Black Hawk, emblazoned with 4 silver stars just below the cockpit window, was not circling. It was landing, its powerful rotors kicking up grass and leaves in an adjacent, unused field. The mood in the cemetery shifted instantly from confusion and embarrassment to sheer, unadulterated awe. The helicopter's skids touched down with a gentle bump. The side door slid open before the massive rotors had even begun to slow their powerful spin. A figure in a perfectly tailored Class A uniform, adorned with the unmistakable 4 stars of a full general, leaped out and began striding towards the gravesite with a long, purposeful gait. He moved with an urgency that seemed to bend the very air around him. Captain Hayes saw the 4 stars and felt a cold dread wash over him, a physical sensation like being plunged into icy water. His brain ceased to function. All that was left was instinct. He snapped to a salute, his hand trembling, his body rigid with terror. General Marcus Thorne didn't even see him. He was a piece of scenery, an obstacle to be bypassed. The general's eyes, flinty and hard, were locked on the old man with the cane. He strode past the captain, past the honor guard, past the grieving widow, and came to a halt no more than 2 feet in front of Arthur Pendleton. The world seemed to stop. The wind died down. The sound of the helicopter's whining turbines faded into the background. For a long, silent moment, the 2 men just stood there, locked in a gaze that spanned 40 years. The 4-star general, one of the most powerful men in the entire United States military, and the unknown old man in a baggy second-hand suit. Then something extraordinary happened. General Thorne, in a movement so sharp and precise it was a thing of beauty, brought his heels together and straightened his body into the most perfect ramrod-straight parade Restaurant Captain Hayes had ever witnessed. It was a position of profound respect, the posture of a subordinate addressing a superior. "Sergeant Major," General Thorne said, his voice thick with an emotion no one could quite decipher. It was a mix of awe, relief, and a deep, abiding respect. "Permission to speak?" A collective gasp went through the small crowd. "Sergeant Major?" The title hung in the air, electric and confusing. Captain Hayes didn't understand. Sergeant Major was an enlisted rank, a senior NCO. Why would a 4-star general, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, be asking a sergeant major for permission to speak as if he were addressing a god? What he failed to grasp was that Arthur Pendleton wasn't just a sergeant major. He was the sergeant major, the man they called the Kingmaker, and Hayes had just tried to have a living legend thrown out of a funeral. Arthur Pendleton looked at the general, the man who was now one of the most powerful military figures in the world, and saw the same eager-to-please, slightly nervous lieutenant he had mentored 4 decades ago. A flicker of a smile touched the corner of his lips, a barely perceptible thing, and he gave a slow, slight nod. "Permission granted, General." The words were quiet, yet they carried the finality of a gavel strike. General Thorne kept his eyes locked on Arthur's for another second, a silent acknowledgment passing between them, before he turned his attention to the shell-shocked Captain Hayes. The general's face transformed, the warmth and respect draining away, replaced by a glacial calm that was far more terrifying than any shouting could ever be. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. "Captain, what is your name?" "Hayes, sir. Captain Evan Hayes," he choked out, his own name sounding foreign in his mouth. "Captain Hayes," Thorne began, his voice like chips of ice. "Do you have any idea who this is?" He gestured with his chin towards Arthur. Hayes could only shake his head, his throat too tight to form words. "You have the command sergeant major of the United States Army from 1985 to 1995 standing not 5 feet from you," Thorne stated, his voice building with a controlled, righteous fury. "This man, Command Sergeant Major Arthur Pendleton, personally trained me. He trained the man you are burying today. He trained half the current Joint Chiefs of Staff. He literally wrote the book on drill and ceremony, the very manual you so clearly failed to read, let alone comprehend. And you, Captain, were about to have him physically removed from this ceremony." The general let the question hang in the frigid air. The weight of it was crushing. Captain Hayes's face was sheet white, his confident arrogance completely stripped away, leaving behind only the terrified boy underneath. He looked like he might faint. Thorne didn't wait for an answer. He turned his back on Hayes, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and faced Arthur once more. His expression softened. "Sergeant Major, the final volley is yours to call, if you would do us the honor." Arthur looked at the 7 young soldiers of the firing squad. He saw the awe, the fear, and the nascent pride in their eyes. He raised his hickory cane, its worn wood a scepter of true authority. He held it there for a single perfect beat, gathering the silence. Then his voice rang out, clear and powerful, the voice of command itself. "Fire!" 7 rifles cracked as one. A single, perfect, deafening report that slammed into the chest and echoed across the valley. A flawless, final tribute to a fallen soldier, called by his first and greatest teacher. A profound silence descended upon the cemetery in the wake of the single, perfect shot. The sound hung in the air, seeming to cleanse it of the earlier shame. Then the only sound was the faint tinkle of 7 spent shell casings hitting the pavement, a sound like tiny metallic bells. At the end of the line, Private Green stood as if he were carved from stone. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't even blinked. Tears streamed down his face, cutting clean paths through the grime of nervous sweat, but he did not move a muscle. He had felt it. The rhythm, the breath, the quiet center. He had gotten it right. Sergeant Miller, his own eyes wet with emotion, barked the commands to bring the rifles down, to order arms, to stand at parade rest. Every movement from the squad was now imbued with a newfound precision, a snap and pop that hadn't been there before. They were no longer a group of individuals. They were a team forged in humiliation and redeemed by a legend. General Thorne stepped over to the colonel's widow, Eleanor Vance. He leaned down and spoke to her softly, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Her gaze shifted to Arthur, and her expression was one of overwhelming, tearful gratitude. Captain Hayes remained frozen, a statue of public humiliation. The 2 MPs who had been about to escort Arthur away were now trying their best to look invisible, their faces burning with shame. They knew they had been seconds away from committing an act of career-ending sacrilege. Arthur Pendleton walked slowly, his limp more pronounced now that the adrenaline was fading, over to the firing squad. He stopped in front of Private Green. The boy was still crying silently, staring straight ahead. Arthur reached out with his wrinkled, trembling hand and placed it on the young soldier's shoulder. The boy flinched at the contact but held his bearing. "Good work, son," Arthur said, his voice back to its quiet, gravelly rasp. "You found the breath." The ceremony was over, but the story wasn't. For Captain Hayes, it was the end of a career. For Private Green, it was the beginning of one. And for General Thorne, it was a debt, long owed, finally paid. After the flag was folded with meticulous care by Sergeant Miller's squad and presented to Eleanor Vance by General Thorne himself, the mourners began to disperse. They left in quiet, respectful groups, whispering about what they had just witnessed. Soon only a small handful of people remained by the graveside. General Thorne, Arthur, the widow, and Sergeant Miller's squad, who stood at a respectful distance awaiting dismissal. Captain Hayes was gone. General Thorne had dismissed him with a single curt sentence. "Report to my office at the Pentagon, 800 tomorrow. You and I are going to have a long conversation about leadership." The finality in the general's tone left no doubt as to the outcome of that meeting. Thorne turned to Eleanor and gently explained who Arthur was, filling in the details of a history she had only heard in fragments from her late husband. John's Colonel Abernathy. He talked about the sergeant major all the time, Thorne said, his voice soft. He said everything he ever learned about being a real leader, about taking care of soldiers, he learned from this man right here. He called him the bedrock. Eleanor Vance approached Arthur, her steps slow but steady. She took his old, wrinkled hand in both of her gloved ones. "Thank you, Sergeant Major Pendleton," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You gave my husband the farewell he deserved. John would have been so proud." Arthur simply nodded, unable to find the words. "He was a good man," he finally managed to say. "One of my best boys." General Thorne put a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Let me give you a ride home, Sergeant Major. It's the least I can do." "Appreciate the offer, Marcus," Arthur said, using the general's first name for the first time. The shift was subtle, but it re-established the old dynamic, teacher to student, mentor to mentee. "But I've got my truck." He started to walk towards the public parking lot, his cane tapping a slow, steady rhythm on the asphalt. The general simply watched him go, a complex mix of respect, nostalgia, and sadness on his face. Arthur made his way to the far end of the parking lot, where a faded blue, slightly rusted 1998 Ford F-150 stood waiting. It was as old and unassuming as he was. Before he could reach for the door handle, he heard footsteps approaching from behind. He turned to see Sergeant Miller and his entire 7-man squad marching towards him in perfect formation. They stopped 3 feet in front of him, and on Miller's unspoken command, snapped to attention. "Sergeant Major," Miller said, his voice ringing with a respect that bordered on reverence. He raised his hand in a salute so sharp it could have cut glass. "It was an honor, sir." In unison, the other 6 soldiers saluted as well. Private Green's salute was the sharpest of all. His eyes were still red, but they were clear and focused. He looked at Arthur not as a boy looks at an old man, but as a soldier looks at a commander. Arthur returned the salute, not with the crisp precision of his youth, but with a slow, deliberate raising of his hand to his brow, a gesture that conveyed a lifetime of duty and a deep, weary respect for the young men who now carried the torch. "You've got a good squad here, Sergeant," Arthur said, his eyes meeting Miller's. "Lead them. Don't just manage them. There's a difference." Miller nodded, understanding completely. "Yes, Sergeant Major." Arthur got into his old truck, the engine turning over with a familiar rumbling cough. He drove away slowly, not looking back. The story of that day became a quiet legend at Arlington, a cautionary tale passed down from seasoned NCOs to arrogant young lieutenants. It was a stark reminder that true authority isn't found on a collar or a shoulder strap, but in a quiet confidence earned through experience. It's a reminder that heroes walk among us, often unseen, their greatness hidden behind the quiet dignity of a life well lived. If you believe in honoring our hidden heroes, subscribe for more stories that matter.